set of slides for the economics revision for F581. Now, this is the last stuff I'll be doing in the winter 2012, going into 2013, January 2013 exam. So if you have any questions, you can post them. I hope you guys can answer your own. I need to move on to do some F583 and F585 work. So taking a look at this presentation, hopefully this should give you the information you need to work on not just the 18 mark, but the earlier part of the exam as well. And generally the advice I give my students, I've taken this presentation from what I delivered in class. So hopefully you find it helpful. Any questions, just fill them in underneath. The first slide I started with was this one, because these are the basic concepts that you learned right in the beginning of the course. These definitions, you should know these either by now or within the next couple of days. These usually come up as 2-mark questions or 4-mark questions, in between that range. Generally being asked to either describe, list, or explain the factors of production that were referred to maybe in the case study, or what is meant by opportunity cost, or show how opportunity cost was used in the case study. These are really straightforward questions, so I'm not spending much time here. But they should be able to match these definitions up. Okay, take a look. Basics of the exam, you got 60 marks, you got an hour and a half. You can use black ink, but pencil is only acceptable for graphs and diagrams only. You can use a calculator. And make sure, this is something I referred our students back to, purely because we had our exam set up so students had 2 clocks, one for extra time, one regular. I always suggest bring a watch so you know what time you start and you know what time you finish. And you're looking at your clock. Do not follow the other clock unless you absolutely have to, because I don't want you to end up thinking you have more time than you do. Your grade boundaries are such, you're looking at roughly 80% and above for an A, between 70 to, which is going to be 48 marks to 60. For the B, between 42 to 47 marks, and for a C, between 36 and 41. These are rough guidelines that I use to mark essays. Of course, grade boundaries change, but if you're aiming for an A, you should be aiming for a couple points above the 48. You should be okay with that. And then these are just, to guide you. These are not concrete, so they do change by exam sittings, but this is a really good, I'd say, estimate of where you could expect to be in order to achieve these grades. In terms of revision resources, you should have the textbook notes consolidated by now. Go through the Tutor to You webpage. The specification map there is brilliant. Look it up if you need to. The revision videos on my channel, a bunch of other teachers have some really good material on here. You should be familiar with it now, given that you've been taking the course for a few months already. Get on the OCR webpage. Check out some old past papers and exams. They also have exemplar work, which is outstanding work and bad work done by students in the past. And it gives you some good guidance on what kind of answers they are expecting. And it's good because it has they have examiner's commentary on it. And a couple of iPod apps I list here on the bottom. What you should currently be doing, establishing your targets, see the areas you need to improve, work through the spec, and consolidate your notes. Make posters of key concepts and start putting them up wherever you go. No supply and demand diagrams inside out, the PPF, consumer surplus, producer surplus, elasticity formulas. Familiarize yourself with as many past papers as possible, just to get an idea of the structure. Right? Don't start memorizing answers and things. Just be able to be comfortable with the structure, and get rid of all doubt. Right? Because if you can start working, if you're working now, I think you got a good shot if you've been working all semester to do well on this. Read through questions first and familiarize yourself with what's being asked. And then those things that refer back to the case. Once you get the exam, questions first, then read the case study, and annotate references to the questions or any kind of link you can make to the questions you're being asked. And then get going. Last year I took a look at the January 2011 exam with students, and there were a few curveballs in that paper. So if you take a look at it, you'll see what I mean in comparison to the others. Just because the way questions were asked was a little bit different to how they had been in the past. And this is something that I expect the OCR to be doing regularly now, because it seems as though they're really changing their papers to challenge students. And then when you go through the exam, you should be able to clearly label which ones are asking for content, which ones are asking for application, analysis, or evaluation. To give you an idea of how you're assessed on this exam, on Unit 1, 30% of your marks, 18, will come from spitting out definitions and just showing that you have knowledge of some specific definition. 30% of your marks will come from applying that knowledge and showing how you can relate it to a situation or perhaps the case study and explain it in context, right? The important thing here is that it's explained in context with reference to something in particular. Show your knowledge there. Assessment objective 3 is your ability to analyze problems and issues. What is the problem? Why is it a problem? How can it be solved? What is a good solution? What's a bad solution? What's the for and against? Basically looking at that. Also being able to analyze changes in supply and demand if you're looking at diagrams or explaining differences. If you look at a diagram and you change the state, right? You start with state 1. For example, you may have a PPF, and then you show it moving outward, and you can explain that that shows a shift outward due to an increase in productivity or improvement in technology. That's analysis at work. Evaluation, the last one, is assessment objective 4, which is 20% of this exam. This is where you're making an informed judgment and saying, based on my arguments and evidence, here's my final answer, and this is what you really need to focus on. This is the toughest skill for students to master here. Exam questions that ask you to explain, define, or list, they're going to generally require content and application. Just ignore that it says light there. Explain, define, list requires content, and in some cases application. Draw, show, or analyze are going to require you to analyze, obviously. It's like I said before about the diagrams and the changing situation. Comment, evaluate, and discuss will all require evaluation. Discuss is generally going to be your final 18-mark question. You may have a comment question regarding supply and demand shifts, or the supply and demand and the business relevance of elasticity estimates. In the final 18-mark question that you've seen plenty of videos on, you'll need to define key terms, argue for and against, potentially suggest an alternative, and then evaluate how effective this solution can be, or what holds it back or what helps it more so than any other method. An activity I like to have students do is go through the exam paper in pairs, answer the shorter questions, and then bullet point responses to the higher mark. As an extension, some will write the higher mark completely. But specifically, if they run into a comment question, I wanted them to focus on like this kind of format. Quick, brief introduction. Argument 4, using point, evidence, explain, as is suggested on Tutor to You. Argument against, point, evidence, and explain, and then evaluate. Going through the specification, it's easy to find out what information you need to know. This is why I suggest using it as guidance. Like, for example, you're going to need to analyze the difference between shifts in demand and supply and movement along demand and supply curves, and be able to know when it happens. When you're asked to discuss the business relevance of different elasticity estimates, that means you need to be able to analyze and then evaluate the importance of this information. Analyze how and why the equilibrium position changes, so that will be a diagram at equilibrium, and then what caused it to change, and the new equilibrium. Discuss whether competitive markets always lead to allocative efficiency, meaning that essentially markets clearing, reaching equilibrium, and why market failure may prevent that, why monopoly power or firm market share may not allow it to happen. Evaluate the impact of indirect taxes, subsidies, regulation, tradable pollution permits, and the provision of information as possible solutions to market failure. Generally, you're going to see this towards the end of the exam, right? How effective are they? Here's a method. How effective is it? Which one's the best? I think recently they asked the students to look at all 4 methods, and then of the 4, which one is the most effective? So you were analyzing for and against 4 of them, generally briefly, and then picking which one was the most effective based on your discussion. I think everybody knows that. Here are some questions from the past papers. Discuss whether healthcare should be provided by government or private. Discuss whether indirect taxes should be reduced. Discuss whether regulation is the most effective way of correcting market failure. In the first one, we're comparing 2 alternatives, government or private. Here, we're taking a look at indirect taxes, for and against decreasing them, and then essentially maybe thinking about another alternative. And then finally we have regulation, right? Is it the regulation the best way, or should we use something else? Now, the most important thing here is that you don't use tradable pollution permits as a regulation, right? Specifically, tradable pollution permits are a market-based approach, so they wouldn't count as a regulation. Here's a list of all the old essays that have come up in the past, going from the legacy papers, which are the previous specification before it was changed, I think around 2009, through to the last paper that I had at the time, which is January 2011. You can find the January 2012 and maybe even the June 2012 essay discussed on my page. But taking a look at these topics, you can generally see market failure is inevitable, pretty much. Right? So you know why market failure is pushed so heavily. It's likely, highly likely to come up as the 18 marker, but be prepared for anything. But I can say if you're comfortable with these questions and the structure, you're in good shape. I always suggest to go online and check out examiners' reports on the OCR page. Hardly students do, but I think it's well worth it. Like this question from January 2009, I'm not going to read the question or what's behind it, but I wanted to show my students what kind of comments come up. This is something written by the exam board saying, as a whole, how students performed. So you can see where the weaknesses are, where the strengths are. And sometimes you can see, like here, right? If you look here down, follow the mouse. It says, on future question papers, the last question will continue to be of a general nature, prompted or referring to the context of the case study. So you can be pretty sure that, this is from 2009, so maybe things have changed. But if you take a look at the most recent examiner's report, it can give you some pretty good guidance on what may or may not come up. And this is all available on that OCR webpage where they have all documents relating to the specification. You just got to dig around a bit. Structure is key. This is for 18 mark and any comment or discuss question. Intro, key terms, keep it brief. Right, as long as you got the key terms out the way for the 18 mark are good. In the shorter ones, you probably have one key term to define. Then start with the for and against, or how this information can be used, why this information is effective, or how this method could work, how it's effective. Then why using this information may be a bad idea, or what's wrong with this information. Then how effective can the decision be made using this information or using this policy. That's the general structure, and you'll see me go into real depth on that in the other videos. Some revision topics, you've covered these. Another approach I like to suggest my students take is called the variation technique. What you do is you take one exam question and you rewrite it in a different way. Like, take a look at this. If you have a question such as, using a demand and supply diagram, show the effects on the market for holidays in the Maldives for foreign British visitors in early 2009. Alright, so I'm going to change it slightly. Using a demand and supply diagram, show the effects on the market for holidays in the Maldives of an increase in British visitors. So, right, small change, but it forces you to test both sides that could come up with this question. Right, so think about at least two other variations. Go back, look at the answers you've written to past papers, and see if you can write it for a variation. These are the diagrams that I've suggested all my students need to know. At the very least, these ones you need to have mastered. Supply, determinants, shifts, and movement. Demand, same. PPF, demonstrate how increasing opportunity cost, or demonstrate how show how opportunity cost can be reflected in the PPF. What's inefficient? How can you show that? What's efficient? Show a point that's unattainable. Show a point that is attainable. Equilibrium, be able to first graph it, then change it, and understand what will happen as a result. Negative externalities, positive externalities, and then methods of correcting this kind of market failure, as well as producer and consumer surplus, define and adjustments. If someone wants to send me a question with a producer and consumer surplus, I'd really like to see it, because this is a sneaky one that a lot of people overlook. Right? A lot of it is in how you diagram the change in producer and the change in consumer surplus. A lot of students get it wrong because of the way they approach the question. So if somebody wants to send me that, I'd be happy to look at it. Once your poster is complete, you'll feed back to the group and that's for my class, not you. Round 1, key terms. This is just a revision game we did. These should all look familiar. You should be able to spell these out word for word. Right, no surprises here. From our mock exam, there was two areas that I wanted to focus on. First was a comment question on business relevance or price elasticity of supply. The second was allocative efficiency. What does it actually mean, and how do you interpret it? What do you do with it? The 4 factors that influence price elasticity of supply: spare production capacity. Right? If I can quickly respond to changes in the market demand and I can make more because I have spare capacity, then it should be relatively elastic. If I can hold stock, that should keep my supply elastic. If I can substitute different factors into producing that good, if I can switch between people and machinery quite easily, then that makes it more elastic. How long will it take me to actually make the product? Again, fresh strawberries are not going to have a very elastic supply. They'll be relatively inelastic because of the time it takes to produce fresh strawberries. But these things, I think that part was clear to students. Where it started to get sticky is generally here. But let me go back through the 4 of them. And there's a mistake here. This should actually read price elasticity of supply. So let me go and fix that. Where are we? Okay, price elasticity of supply. Know the formula. Generally, they're going to be similar. Percent change in price, percent change in income, percent change in price of another good, percent change in price. Okay, inelastic interpretation. How do you tell if it's inelastic? Well, this is going to be relatively small, right? Less than 1 or -1, between -1 and 1. Income elasticity. They're all going to generally be the same, right? Between -1 and 1. Elastic interpretation, right? The number, what does it mean? And not just only the number and that it's being elastic. What does that mean? And in this instance, let's see, price elasticity of demand. If it's very elastic, then consumers are very responsive to a change in price. And its relevance to business. How could you use this information? Right? If you've got PED, how would you use it? I think generally you're looking at revenue, response to competitors here, which target market you could focus on when you look at income, price elasticity of supply, businesses' ability to respond. What strategies could they take to take advantage of the fact that they have elastic supply or maybe inelastic? How could they improve their situation? You need to really consider this because you can gain a couple marks in the exam here. If you've glanced over this when you were studying or moved over it really quickly in class, please be sure you can write at least 2 to 3 sentences on each of these areas. Our demand condition for allocative efficiency is that price should equal marginal cost. This will occur at market equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market. And what do we mean by consumer welfare being maximized? And think about points on the PPF being allocatively efficient, but not points within. Some last minute tips: be able to define these basic definitions, explain and adjust the PPF with correct labels. Explain how specialization can be used to address this problem scarcity. List and explain the 4 factors of production. Same advice I'm about to give you for demand, I want you to consider for supply. All right, define it and the surplus attached. So this one's consumer surplus, supply is producer. Understand the difference between a movement along and a shift. Analyze the shift and show what happens. And label to death. Right? Make sure you label everything super accurately. Because if you're not labeling accurately, you're throwing away points. Looking at supply, define that and producer surplus. Understand the difference between movement and shifts. Again, label to death. Right? I always make such a big point of this. My students have done generally a good job in the past of making sure they have accurate labels. Right? These will make a lot of difference. So axis, price, quantity, equilibrium, quantity, the new curve shifted S, S1, however you've done it, please make sure it's correct. Equilibrium, make sure it's where supply and demand meet. Check the question. Are either one, supply or demand, inelastic? If not, carry on as usual, but make sure you're looking for that. If it's saying that the demand for this product was inelastic in the case study, then they ask you to draw a diagram. You need to keep that in mind and draw an inelastic demand curve. Shift the correct curve in the correct direction. Don't screw that up. That's important to note. And notice price increases and decreases, right? Because we go P to P1, price goes up, price goes down, so it can increase or decrease. Quantity can increase or quantity can decrease. Equilibrium changes or moves, right? Don't ever tell me that or tell anyone that equilibrium increases or equilibrium decreases. No, equilibrium price can increase or decrease. Equilibrium quantity can increase or decrease. But the equilibrium point can change, move, can now be found at, but that does not increase or decrease. When you're talking about that specific point, that would be PQ, that may change to P1Q1 or P1Q, whatever it changes to, it changes. It does not increase or decrease. Elasticities, know the formulas. Generally, the definition is always going to be a version of the following. It measures the responsiveness of demand, if it's these 3. supply, if it's this one, of a good with respect to a change in the price, income, price of another good. It measures the responsiveness of demand, supply of good, with respect to change in pricing. Good. The formula will always be based on the following: percent change in quantity demanded or supplied versus percent change in price, income, or price of another good. PED, PES, always positive, so don't worry about them, in the sense that remove the sign and just look for the size. Cross elasticity and income elasticity, examine the sign and size. In both instances, for cross and income, sign determines the relationship, size determines the strength of the relationship. And so what is my next question? If you calculate these elasticities and you get the information, great, I'm happy for you. But why are they useful to a business? Right, think about the case study. What can that business do with that information? How can they use that to make an informed decision to increase revenue or do something better for the business or respond to competition? Think. You need to talk about that. And then also consider what if you get a business relevance question that you need to generally evaluate if they ask you to comment. Because what are the limitations of that information? Holding everything else equal, is that really possible? And what could happen if the business acted on figures? Remember, if you're in a business and somebody's collected statistics for you, who are they? How did they collect that information? And how do you know that that information is accurate and reliable? And have things changed since that information was collected? And if I act on that information, is there a cost to me? Right, so you really need to consider everything when you evaluate. And generally, I suggest if you have a 7 to 8 mark question, you should write at least 2 to 3 sentences about this specific area of evaluation. While this information may be helpful to this business, for example, there are limitations due to the fact that this information may not be accurate, and if the business were to act upon this information, they may run into trouble down the road. Some kind of discussion about any of the things that are brought up. Allocative efficiency, where price equals marginal cost, where consumer welfare is maximized. And then talk about what makes an efficient market. It's got to be an equilibrium, there's an efficient allocation of resources, and think about what prevents a market from reaching equilibrium and being efficient. And maximizing welfare is when there's market failure, a firm can exercise market power. All right, be able to define it. This you're probably done to death, so I'm just going to leave this slide up. If you want to pause and take a look at it, go for it. And that's really it. So I wish you guys luck. It should be fine. You got a couple of weeks to go. Any other questions, just leave them for me on this page.